Welcome to 100 Plus, a historical overview of the most important people, events, and ideas of the last 2,000 years. This is a survey of the forces and factors that have shaped today's world, the Christian faith, Western civilization, and you. In today's episode, Mike will be focusing on the story of the Pilgrims, the small group of English separatists who boarded the Mayflower in 1620 on a journey across the Atlantic. It was a journey full of peril, but one they took in search of religious freedom. And they succeeded and grew, and 150 years later, the 13 colonies that had grown out of this group threw off British oppression and founded the United States. At least, that is the way the story is told around Thanksgiving. As Mike will explain, it's a bit more complicated than that, but very important, not just as a source of courage and faithfulness for us today, but also to those who value Christian and American history.
On the morning of November 9th, 1620, after 65 days at sea, during which they had been slowed by headwinds and battered by storms, the weary passengers of the Mayflower finally saw land, the New World. As you can imagine, they were relieved that their journey across the Atlantic was over, but for those English separatists, the story was just beginning. And given who they were, and given how things played out over time, it's not unfair to say, for most listening to this podcast, it was not just their story, but it's our story as well. Our focus in this episode is on the Puritans, more specifically on the Pilgrims, who were a subset of the Puritans, and more specifically still on those Pilgrims who sailed to the New World in the early part of the 17th century and then signed the Mayflower Compact. This is lecture 48 in our tour to plagiarize David Gress, From Plato to NATO. We are looking back to the onset of Western civilization, that being Plato and his kin, and then tracing the stories and themes that lead us to today, NATO, although we'll push past the founding of NATO, which was in the 1949. So during this overview, we are paying particular attention to important people, events, and ideas of church history, and we have an eye on gaining personal density. Our goal is not just to cram historical trivia into our brain in some vain effort to better answer Jeopardy questions. We're trying to understand the flow of history so that we can marvel at the hand of God, understand what is unfolding in the world, and in light of all that, live more thoughtfully and faithfully. At the moment, we are in the 9th era. Well, we started back with the Greek philosophers, traced the rise of Rome, and then its decline, noting that the decline was due in part to the rise of the Church of Jesus Christ. We then traced all of this into the Dark Ages, and then noted the rest of the Middle Ages, also called Christendom, that 1,000-year period, that then eventually dropped us off at the Renaissance, which was followed by the Reformation, all of which brought us into the 17th century and the changes it brought, principally the Enlightenment. In episode 46, we did a flyover of the 17th century. In 47, we looked specifically at the scientific revolution. And 2 lectures on the Enlightenment are ahead of us. Today, I want you to understand that while Europe was undergoing all kinds of political, economic, cultural, and religious changes, while Copernicus and Galileo and Locke and Newton and Descartes and all of those guys were shaking things up on the other side of the pond, there were big things happening in the New World. I'm thinking particularly about the colonial expansion of England into New England. However, because all of us have some idea of what happened, the story is retold every November, but because the story that is retold every November is a little bit fuzzy, a little bit wide of the mark in terms of what actually happened, we need to start by clearing away some of the brush. The way the story is often told goes like this. There was a group of English Christians who were being denied the ability to worship freely. In fact, they were being persecuted. Eventually, they grew so tired of this oppression that they scraped together all the money that they had and escaped on board a ship, the Mayflower, headed to the United States. It was a hard passage, and then after they arrived in New England, it got harder for various reasons, namely a bitter cold winter. They struggled to survive, but eventually, with the help of God and friendly Indians, the natives, the indigenous First Nation residents. They established Plymouth Colony. And in an act of gratefulness to God, they established the holiday we celebrate at Thanksgiving. From this humble beginning, this group grew until 150 years later, spread out now among 13 colonies. They declared their independence from England, and the United States was born. You've heard this story. You've told this story. You've watched the plays. You've eaten the food. I'm thinking, of course, of Thanksgiving. And you've celebrated all of it. Did it happen this way? Well, sort of. Yes and no, but there's enough no that we want to go back and retrace the actual events. So we're putting the Enlightenment on hold for just a little bit in order to drill down on the Pilgrims and some of the early developments behind the United States. Honestly, I feel like one of those guys that's spinning plates. And at the moment, we need to jump back to the U.S. plate, the American plate, which I started spinning a while ago when I mentioned the founding of Jamestown. So we'll be turning back to the plates of the Enlightenment in Europe and all that stuff very soon. But we need to make note of developments in the early part of the 17th century in America. So before we step into that, I need to introduce a few key concepts, ideas, and events, starting with the term Puritan. As you may remember from a few episodes back, the English Reformation went down a unique path. Most European Christians were either Roman Catholic or they had embraced one of the three protest movements. They were Lutheran, or they were Reformed, sometimes called Calvinist, or they were Anabaptist. The church in England, which was also Protestant, it was a protest movement, but the church in England chose a unique path. I mentioned the various theories about when the church in England got its start. You know, some go all the way back to Joseph of Arimathea and the Gospels. Some go back to the 6th century when Augustine of Canterbury, not Augustine of Hippo, not the Augustine, but Augustine of Canterbury, who was commissioned by Pope Gregory the Great to head and plant the church. Some go there. Others say no, nothing really got started until Thomas Cranmer helped King Henry VIII get a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and to marry Anne Boleyn. This led to a break with the Pope, which led to the English Act of Supremacy, in which the English Parliament declared that the church in England was no longer going to answer to the Pope. It was going to report to the King. So for today's focus, deciding which of those streams is actually the most accurate doesn't really matter. What's important to note is that the Puritans is the name given to those who did not feel as though the reforms made by Cranmer and those who followed were sufficient. So I talked about some of this in episodes 42 and 45, but the Puritans described those who felt that more purification needed to happen in the church in England. So the term Puritan is actually pretty complicated and layered. It's used to describe people over a 100 to 150-year period, 200-year period perhaps, on two different continents, and so it's often misunderstood. And the term is often disparaged. In my preparation for this lecture, I was reminded that there was a journalist, and a prominent American journalist, I think early 20th century, H.L. Mencken, who had a quote. He was not a Christian, very critical of the church, and he said, "A Puritan is someone who is worried that somewhere someone is having fun." So that's not very accurate, not helpful. Let me say this. It is an incomplete but not inaccurate statement to say that the Puritans were those who thought the Anglican Church still had too much of the Roman Catholic Church in it. The Puritans were those who thought that the Anglican Church was only halfly reformed and, quote, smeared with the dregs of popery. They were specifically sideways over the Anglicans' embrace of the normative principle, which teaches, and this carries through today, you'll occasionally hear people talk about this, the normative versus the regulative principle. So the normative principle says that if the Bible doesn't say something is wrong, then it's okay for it to be in the worship service. The regulative principle says that worship services can only have in them the things that we find in Scripture. So anything not explicitly advocated in the Bible is disparaged. So, for example, those who follow the regulative principle, those who follow the regulative principle, as the Puritans did, are against hymn singing. Hymn singing is not mentioned in the Bible, so they don't want hymns. All they want are psalms, which are in the Bible, obviously, to be sung. By holding to the regulative principle, the Puritans hoped to remain close to the purity of the primitive church. And they thought that the Anglican Church needed to do a whole lot more reforming. You can see, by the way, Christ Church's Lake Forest campus has Puritan architecture. So it is clean and it is simple. There's not a whole lot of ornamentation. There's not a big chancel. There's not stained glass. There's not any of these things because they're not mentioned in the Bible. The Puritans did not like the Anglican Church's use of the Book of Common Prayer. They thought it got in the way of the Bible. They did not like the Anglican priests reciting written prayers. They thought prayers should be from your heart. They did not like the Anglican priests kneeling during communion, anyone crossing themselves when they say the name of the Lord, or of priests wearing vestments. So, for that matter, it wasn't just the worship practice of the Anglicans that the Puritans did not like. They felt that the Church of England had not gone far enough in reforming church governance. So they thought that the Anglicans were right to get rid of the Pope, but they were wrong to hold on to bishops. And they said, this is not the New Testament model. And by the way, whenever you've got a fight over bishops, what you're really having a fight over is not just control and power, but you're having a fight over who has the ability to appoint the pastors to the churches. Is it the congregations? Is it elders within the congregation? Is it a bishop outside of the congregation? So the first thing to know is Puritan is a term that describes a lot of different things over 200 years, but in particular, it's those that want to purify the Anglican Church. A second thing to note about the Puritans is that they divided over how to respond to these problems, which is going to be important because we're going to get a particular branch of this division that is going to come to come to America to start a colony here. So you might think, because we're hundreds of years later, that the division between the Anglicans and the Puritans is over theology. It's a division between the conservatives and the liberals, the liberals being the Anglicans and the conservatives being the Puritans. That's not really what was going on. So what you had is some, called the conformists, believed that the Anglican Church needed to reform more, but that they needed to stay in it and to work from the inside to try and exercise that reform. A second group, the separatists, believed that it was a sin to remain in an unbiblical church. One of the separatist groups was known as the Brownists, after their father, Robert Brown. The two things to note about the Brownists were they were, first of all, not surprised, Congregationalists. So they, again, thought that their members should be able to vote and appoint their pastor, and that every local church was independent of every other local church. They had control over who was the pastor and who the members were. The second thing to note about the Brownists is that a Brownist church in Scrooby, England, is the one that is going to board the Mayflower. So, the third thing to know about the Puritans. The first is they're Reformed Anglicans. The second is they divided over how to interact with the Anglican Church, to stay or to go. The third is the Puritans were more fun than you think. Few groups suffer as much bad press as the Puritans. I mean, when your name is turned into an adjective, puritanical, to describe everything that is dark and dour and joyless, when people hear Puritans and they think, Hester Prynne and black and big buckles on your shoes and your hats, none of which is true, by the way. Hester Prynne, Scarlet Letter was written 150 years later, and it doesn't reflect what was actually going on. And they didn't wear big buckles on their shoes and on their hats and all of that. Not very accurate. But C.S. Lewis goes actually at some length into defending the Puritans. And you pick up on this if you read his academic book. So Lewis was, of course, a medieval scholar and of literature. So he wrote a literary criticism book, English Literature in the 16th Century. And he has delightful things to say about the Puritans and notes that most people get them completely wrong. That said, they took faith and church very seriously. Their membership in the church was not just based on baptism. You were entering into a covenant. It was a very deep, binding kind of commitment that you were making to God and to others. And church services, by the way, pretty much went all day. So I think it was basically you went from 8 in the morning until 6 at night. You had 2 hours off for lunch. So I don't want to hear any complaints about a 65-minute service. But I digress. Here we are. The fourth thing to say about the Puritans is the Puritans living in England eventually left England and then left Europe in search of religious freedom. This is one of those situations that's difficult for us to imagine because America is going to be this new experiment. And so back then, you realize atheism is not an option until you have Darwin coming along and offering some sort of explanation about how life could be here without God creating life. So it's not to say there weren't atheists, but you didn't have many atheists. And so in each country in which you lived, there was usually some prescribed faith, some prescribed creed that you were expected to follow. And so different countries were Catholic or they were Protestant, Lutheran, whatever. And you were expected to be part of that church. It was expected that you were going to do church according to the way the person in charge of that church said church should be done, which in a Catholic setting would be the Pope and then the priest. And then in Protestant settings, it would be often the king as the leader of the church. And in England, it was the king. So this means that everyone had a lot less personal and religious freedom than we do today. Indeed, you could be persecuted, even killed, if you did not walk the line. Now, in truth, the hassle factor in England for people living there in the 17th century was relatively low. The Puritans sort of come into their own under Elizabeth. So King Henry VIII breaks away from the Pope. Then you have, after King Henry VIII, you're fairly quickly going to get to Mary, so Bloody Mary, who's Catholic. But then we're going to get back to a more Protestant sovereign, and that will be Elizabeth. She is going to disappoint just about everybody, but she's going to be a moderating voice, and she's mostly going to follow the Church of England as opposed to the Catholic creed. She will let the Puritans bark all they want, as one scholar said, provided that they don't bite. She's replaced by James I, who was the King of Scotland, and then he also would become the King of England. And there was some hope because the Scottish situation was Presbyterian, so you didn't have bishops. So the Puritans were very excited about getting James, and they were hoping that they were going to get more of of a Puritan format. James said absolutely not. He did almost nothing that the Puritans wanted him to do, except, and we'll look at this, he did give them the King James Version of the Bible. James basically, the Puritans can sort of survive without persecution of any significance under James. But then his son, Charles I, comes along, and Charles I is trouble. He's much more controlling. He believes in the divine right of kings. Basically, the king is king, almost a little god. And he's going to boot out a lot of priests. He's really going to try and take control. And under Charles, there's actually going to be, he's going to launch sort of an anti-Puritan movement. There will be a civil war. Charles I will lose his head in this whole thing. For a while, England is not going to have a king. They're going to go with a different form of government. But then Charles' son, Charles I's son, creatively named Charles II, is going to come along, and they're he's going to march them back, and there is going to be some persecution. So I'm highlighting this because the idea of a state church is something that will not be part of the U.S. Constitution. So when we famously got in this country the separation of church and state, what was initially being established was not this idea that the church cannot influence the state. It was that there would be no state church to influence the people, that the government would not influence the church. It wasn't to say that the church could not influence the government. That was expected, actually, but that the government would not influence the church. So today, people act like it's the opposite. But anyway, so things are going to get worse for the Puritans in the latter part of the 17th century. But they were bad enough in the early part of the 17th century that some are going to leave. And this is what we hear about. This is where we talk about they're denied the ability to worship. They suffer, and eventually they scrape together enough money to sneak away on this ship. And it's a hard passage and all that. When they get there, it's a bad winter, and that's how we get America. So there's truth to that story, but more folklore. So let me explain what happened, and I'll do it in 9 points. The first thing, number one, the first thing for you to know is that the key players in this story was a group of separatists from Scrooby, England. They were Brownists, which means Congregationalists, and there were 2 of them that are prominent. John Robinson was the minister. He was a Cambridge man. He had been in the Church of England, but in 1605 he had left the Church of England to become a Puritan, and he had joined this separatist church in Scrooby, and before very long he had become the pastor. He is dearly loved by his people. The second person to note is William Bradford, who will become a future governor, who will also be the one who writes the book, or sort of keeps the diary that we look to for our reports about what was happening in the new land. First thing to note is Scrooby, England. The second point is that in 1607, this group in Scrooby decides to flee to Leiden, which is in Amsterdam. It's a textile town in Holland. They go there because they hear that there's more religious freedom to be had. By 1608, they are established there, and they will live there for the next 11 years. And during those 11 years, the church will grow from 100 people to 400 people. Many of these people are not converts. They're fleeing England in search of greater freedom themselves. Point number 3. In 1617, this group makes the decision that they're going to leave for America. In spite of their growing numbers, and in spite of the closeness they felt towards each other, in 1617, many in the church, including the minister, John Robinson, feel that God is calling them to leave Holland and to move to the New World. There were a handful of reasons they wanted to do this. Life in Leiden was hard. They were working 6, sometimes 7 days a week in the textile factories. Consequently, they had low morale. Their children were turning out to not be English. They were becoming Dutch. and they wanted to take the gospel to the New World. So they understood that this trip, that this adventure would be full of risks. They were aware of the accounts of Indian attacks in America. They were aware of the lost colony of Roanoke, which is still a mystery. We don't know what happened to this colony that was established in the early 1600s in Roanoke. They completely disappeared. They were aware that those who had settled in Jamestown had nearly starved to death. They were also aware of recent reports at this point of the Blackwell expedition. So Francis Blackwell, an elder of the ancient church, so an elder of a church, not theirs, had set forth across the Atlantic to plant a colony in Virginia, and his ship was ravaged by disease. By the time they arrived in Virginia, 130 of the 180 passengers, including Blackwell himself, were dead. So they knew of the dangers. But in spite of this and the uncertainties, they decided to go. They want religious freedom. The fourth thing to know is that they needed sponsors. So here is where we run into a few factors where you may be slightly misinformed. In some accounts, the Pilgrims are going to piece together the money for the trip and then escape from Europe. Not exactly. So in the 1600s, England is in fierce competition with France and especially Spain to try and establish colonies around the world. The Spanish were off to a great head start, and so the French and the English were doing everything they could to catch up. They needed people to go to this new world. So in 1606, James I, King James, had established the Virginia Company to help finance this. He didn't have the money to do this, but he allows for people to invest in the new world. And so the group now enlightened, this Scrooby English group, this Brownist group of pilgrims, are going to get permission. It's called a patent. They're going to get a patent that gives them land. And the way it works is if they're there for like 7 years, then the land gets deeded to them and other things. But they have to help establish these colonies for the New World. So they get a patent, but they don't have the funding. Thankfully, eventually some people come along with this fellowship group of merchant adventurers. And they're going to, Thomas Weston is going to invest in them. So they are going to have this partnership and they get the funding that they need. So at first it sounds great because Weston and his merchant adventurers were Puritan sympathizers. They also wanted to see Christianity brought to America. And so it looked like this was all going to work out. But some problems emerge. First of all, Weston procrastinates getting a ship. And this is going to push their launch late, and it's going to mean that they don't arrive with enough time to plant, and they're going to have that miserable winter. Secondly, the merchant adventurers altered the original terms of the agreement, at least what they had talked about, and it really turns the Pilgrims into sort of indentured servants. And so tragically, one of the Pilgrims signs this contract. So we've got a little moment here in saying we needed more lawyers on this group to proof the contract, but it wasn't proofed. So then when the other Pilgrims find out what kind of contract has been signed, they say they're not going to go, and so they're going to have to buy out part of Weston, which means they're going to have to sell some of the food they had for the trip. That will also be difficult. And then the third thing that they really didn't like, way that this went south, is that the merchant adventurers insisted that others go on the trip. It's not just the separatists from Leiden that are going to go. So some of these people that are being added had some connections with the Leiden congregation, others did not. So this other group, who are not the Pilgrims, are called, by the Pilgrims, they're called the strangers. So, in spite of all these setbacks, the Leiden Pilgrims make preparations, and on July 22nd, 1620, they set sail from Holland. So they board a ship called the Speedwell, which that there's a moment there, a tearful moment where Robinson, their pastor, who's not going with them at this point, prays for them and weeps for them, and there's sort of a departure there. The Speedwell takes them to the Mayflower. So the Speedwell is smaller than the Mayflower, but they all get to the Mayflower, which is a bigger ship, and they're very excited about that. And then, 102 passengers and crew pile into the Mayflower. On September 6th, which is late, they set forth from Plymouth, and one of the first things they did when they began their sail was to read a letter that Robinson had written to them. And this letter is very important. Robinson advocates 4 things. 1, daily repentance for sins both known and unknown. 2, peace with others, particularly, Robinson says, with the strangers. They should avoid conflict, judging, and condemning the strangers. 3, common employment for the common good. And 4, the formation of a civil government with governing officials. So this letter from Robinson is very significant because it's going to be sort of a significant informing document for what will become the Mayflower Compact, which will later become one of the key documents in establishing constitutional law in America. So, look, it's complicated. All of this government, church government stuff is complicated, but what we see is that there's always tension and there's always a need to try and figure out how is the church going to relate to the state. Initially, the church, Christians have no rights. They're persecuted, right, that first 300 years until Constantine comes along. Then they're not advocated by the government, but then they sort of, over time, they start to have a relationship with the government. All of this stuff is very complicated. So there's been a whole lot written about this, but the Mayflower Compact, which is coming, will prove to be a very important document just down the line. And it will be important in part, not just because it helps inform our constitutional government, but also because it keeps the early group from splintering. So, point number 6 is that when they get to the United States, they're supposed to be at Hudson Bay, they have arrived at the wrong place. They are about 300 miles too far north from where they should be. But on November 9th, the Mayflower spotted land, and they were more than 300 miles north of the Hudson River, their intended destination. So they initially decided to try and correct and to go further south. But after some false attempts at that, they don't quite have the maps, it looks like it's going to be a little bit perilous, they decide to go back to where they had landed. And at this point, the strangers say, if we're going to settle in Cape Cod, then we don't actually have the legal right to do this. This is not where our patent is going to be good. Therefore, we're now under no one's rule or jurisdiction. And they spoke openly about splintering off from the Leiden Pilgrims. So it's under these circumstances that, point number 7, the Mayflower Compact was formed. Likely written by William Brewster, and it said they should work together, and it spelled out how. I'll read a big part of it. Having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do these present solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civic body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, into which we promise all due submission and obedience. So if this sounds to you like what you would expect a group like this to write, that is in no small part because you are an American and a Christian. In fact, it was a fairly radical document about how they were going to govern themselves and appoint people and other things. So, on the morning of November 11th, 41 adult men, which was 90% of those of the ship's adult male population. They signed this compact as their captain was guiding the Mayflower into Provincetown Harbor. That same day, 16 men, heavily armed, set out from the Mayflower and went ashore to explore their new home. And Bradford describes that. They get to the shore, they fall on their knees, bless God of heaven. Lots of thankfulness for their arrival. 8, the first winter is a very difficult one. Indeed, as rough as the crossing had been, the first year was harder. Because they were late getting there, they stayed on the boat, and during the winter, half the population ended up dying from disease and lack of adequate shelter. Which brings us to point number 9, Squanto and Thanksgiving. For the Pilgrims, one of the signs of God's providential care came in the form of an Indian, a man named Squanto, which I understand was the name of the initial University of Illinois chief fighting Illini back when the Illini had a mascot being the chief fighting Illini. Anyway, I don't know what they're doing today, but Squanto was the name that they initially picked. And he befriends them. He had been to Europe. He had learned English. He had come back. He had discovered that his tribe had been wiped out somehow, whether by disease, which is going to be a problem as you've got Europeans introducing diseases from Europe. Smallpox really devastated a lot of the Indians, other things as well. Or whether they were wiped out by another tribe, or whether they starved, whatever happened, he has no people. So he befriends the settlers. Because he spoke English, he was able to teach them how to grow food, how to catch fish, becomes a liaison between them and other Indian tribes. And they are very, very grateful to Squanto, see him as nothing short of a godsend, and a treasured instrument of God's favor and grace extended to them. So with his help, after that really rough winter, they have a relatively good harvest in that fall. And that's going to become the catalyst for this, one of the more famous events in American history, the first Thanksgiving. So this is now 1621, and they have a celebration. I'm not going to say much about it. You can read about this, of course, every November. The newspapers always carry stories about what the first Thanksgiving was like and what they probably ate and other things. Besides, the real impetus for Thanksgiving as the holiday as we celebrate it was Abraham Lincoln. That's when Lincoln is the one who declares Thanksgiving should be an American holiday. At the end of the Civil War, the country, of course, is devastated. He's looking to sort of pull things together, provide some thinking about reasons to be grateful, and he holds up this first Thanksgiving. And in truth, the Puritans were familiar with Thanksgiving services. I mean, the Psalms are full of them, and so it's very possible that in addition to food and games and other things that we hear that they did, that it would have been a worship service as well. So let me turn the corner here and start to wrap up. There's a lot of other things that we're not mentioning here at this particular juncture. For starters, I read somewhere that there's 38 million descendants of the Mayflower Pilgrims. I'm not sure I believe that, but what I do know, and what does need to be emphasized here, is that the Mayflower Pilgrims were not perfect. For starters, their desire for a pure, godly community produced some very heavy-handed theocratic tendencies. For example, only church members were allowed to vote in elections. Secondly, their religious intolerance proved to be a major shaping force in American history. Other colonies are going to be formed in response to the intolerance of the Pilgrims and the Puritans in Massachusetts. And of course, this is, the irony is not lost on anyone who thinks about it. They flee They flee Europe because they don't have religious freedom, and then once they are in charge, they're not granting religious freedom. Roger Williams was exiled from the Massachusetts Bay Colony because of his Baptist views. Imagine that. In response, Williams founds the colony in Rhode Island to provide a place where Baptists and other non-Puritans could worship freely. Pennsylvania is founded as on a principle of religious tolerance. Besides accusations of theocracy, some have also questioned the Pilgrims' dealings with the Native Americans, the First Nation. Of course, that's true. However, with all their faults, do not miss that they give us a stunning example of faith that produces courageous action and self-sacrifice in the midst of suffering. And they certainly do. And then there are other things that we might think about here. I'll just foreshadow that one of the big questions I get asked, I'm not sure I get asked it as much recently as I used to be, but is America a Christian nation? Well, it's a complicated question in part because you're trying to figure out what exactly are people asking. And there are some who sort of go all in and want to see the United States as sort of being almost the replacement, Americans being the replacement of the Jews and some sort of hyper manifest destiny and other things. No, I certainly don't go down that path. Then there's others that are gonna say, well, weren't we founded by Christians? Well, okay, this is not the founding of the United States. This is a colony. And there's lots of other colonies. And a lot of people think that the only people that were getting this started here they were all Christians, they were all Puritans, they were all there in search of religious freedom. No, that's just not the case. It's more complicated than that. And then we need to note that when the United States is established, it is established with this separation of church and state. In other words, there's not going to be a state church, which I think is actually a brilliant thing, a good thing, a helpful thing. State churches tend to be generally tend to be pretty spiritually dead. And if this was a state church, I would be an employee of the government, which I would not be excited about. So there's more to say. There's so much more to the Puritans. The Puritans are going to continue, and we'll get into later Puritans. We get into the later 17th century. We have Puritans like Jonathan Edwards and Puritan divines and big biblical scholars on both sides of the divide. For now, let me just say, there's a lot of myth-making about what went on around this time. And I learned a lot, by the way, in reading up for this lecture. I did not know, maybe you did, but I did not know, that until the colonial work here and the shipping of goods back, in Europe, there were no potatoes. The Irish got their potatoes from America. There was no tobacco here. There were no tomatoes. No tobacco in Europe. No tomatoes in Europe. There were no horses in the United States. I thought the Mustangs were running free and clear for hundreds of years. The Indians get their horses from the settlers from Europe. So trade is going to kick in, and again, as I mentioned, disease is coming from Europe that is going to decimate a lot of the native population. So lots going on, and we're now going to be spinning these plates both in Europe and in the United States. We're going to get a lot of cross-pollinization as we look at the church and as we look at Western civilization. But that will wrap things up. We have coming up in relative near future, going back to the Enlightenment, also looking at the King James Version of the Bible. All for now.